Despite some of the grim news in the first part of your book, which really kind of displays or portrays a very grim picture, you also offer hope. In other words, securing food for everyone can lessen or be removed one of the primary tensions that are leading to these wars and conflicts that we're seeing today in many of these failed states. So I guess the good news of your book is we can avoid this coming problem or famine or even the conflicts that result of it. So let's talk about the better side of what we can do about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I am indeed an optimist. I believe that we humans have got a fantastic capability to solve these sorts of problems, but we have a tendency to kind of, just let things drift for a long time and not take preemptive action. I think in this case we need to take preemptive action because we've got to rearm 1.8 billion farmers around the world with the new knowledge that they need to farm sustainably into the future. And we've got to allow them to have the land and the water that they need to grow the food that we need. And we've got to develop our cities in ways that recycle. Instead of throwing our food in the garbage and sending it to landfill, let's recycle the nutrients and put them back into agriculture. Because, these immense cities of 20 or 30 million people, if the trucks don't come one night, because there's a local war or a fuel shortage or something like that, if the trucks fail to come every day, then that city will starve within a week. So these mega cities that we're building are dreadfully vulnerable because they don't have any internal food production. They rely on food coming from hundreds, even thousands of miles away. And if the transport chain breaks down, they'll be in all sorts of trouble. So we have to shore them up. And one way to do that would be to create new urban-based food industries. I think there are fabulous opportunities here to recycle the water and nutrients that you already have in the city into hydroponic vegetable production, into biocultures where you're producing nutritious protein and things like that in biological vessels and things of that sort. These are new industries which we have not yet developed and which we really need to start focusing on. There are great opportunities for investment in this area. And these are the way we're going to feed our big cities in the future, as well as from the farm. But we haven't yet really started redesigning our cities with sufficient emphasis on these things now.
I want to move on to a major issue that it's directly related to food, and that's the production of water shortages. I mean, plain and simple, no water, no food. And that brings us up to date on what is happening to water and why water is becoming scarce. I mean, we're hearing drought, okay, there's temperature, there's climate change, but we're talking about water becoming scarce. You're also talking about food becoming scarce.
Yeah, one thing that we don't tend to realize is how much water we all use personally. I mean, we tend to think of the water we use personally as what we run in the shower or something like that. But in reality, we use thousands of times more water than that. And the water goes into the food we produce. Your cup of coffee, which you have every morning, took 140 litres of water for you to produce. Basically, over a lifetime, you and I, Jim, will each use 100,000 tonnes of water to grow the food that we will consume in that lifetime. I mean, that's enough water to actually float the USS Enterprise, which is a big aircraft carrier. So it's an awful lot of water per person. And we're not very careful about that water. We tend to pollute it and we tend to flush it into the sea and things like that. And we tend to take it away from farmers who can't afford to pay high prices for water. But we, in our cities and industries, we can afford to pay higher prices for water. So that's what's happening. Farmers are getting robbed by the cities. They're getting robbed by the climate. That is, that the climate is tending to dry out over the Great Grain Belts. That's a function of climate change that's going on. There are competing uses for water. In many countries, there is oil and gas and coal mining going on, which is either polluting or taking away the farmer's groundwater. Every country on earth that uses groundwater to grow food is currently mining that groundwater. In other words, it's using it faster than the groundwater can be recharged. You're seeing it in the Ogallala Aquifer in the United States. You're seeing it here in Australia. You're seeing it all around the world, basically. Groundwater is running out. In China and in India particularly, they have a groundwater crisis there, with the groundwater sinking by a metre or more every year. And, once it runs out, what are they going to use to grow their food with? These are problems that need resolution very, very quickly. And they need a lot of science to solve them. I must say that. We need to do more R&D to actually overcome these problems. But we also, I think we need to put a much higher price on water because we're wasting it in a ridiculous fashion at the moment. So those are the sorts of things that we can do to head off this type of problem. But at the moment, you're not getting much thinking by the world's governments along these lines.
You know, some of these things you would think would be addressed by government, but as you point out in your book, and beginning with the meeting that began with the G8 in the summer of 2008, where world leaders woke up and said, they thought the food problem is solved. Given the probability that this crisis is unlikely to be solved by government, I guess, the next question, Julian, is what can the individual do?
Well, the individual can moderate their diet. I mean, instead of eating that 2 pounds of beef, which use 15,000 litres of water to produce, we can eat 1 pound of beef. I'm not saying stop eating beef or become a vegetarian or anything. I'm just saying moderate your impact on the farming environment by eating a bit less of the high energy, high water demand foods, and particularly eat more of the foods that are going to benefit you. They're going to keep you alive longer, keep you healthy longer. So this is a win-win for the individual consumer. We need awareness of this, and I'm conscious that many people are growing up in cities in particular with no knowledge of where their food comes from, all around the world today. I think we need to install a year of food education in every junior school on the planet. So when you learn your mathematics or when you learn your social studies, when you learn geography, when you learn science, you're learning about food production. You're learning where food comes from. You're learning how plants grow, how animals reproduce, that sort of thing. When you learn about sport, you learn about what is a healthy diet at the same time, so that we raise a new generation of human consumers who are aware of what it actually costs the planet to feed them, and who therefore eat in a more moderate fashion. Because I think that's the one thing. It's not just population growth that we've got to get on top of, but also this overeating that is going on, not just in the Western world, but also in the increasingly prosperous Third World as well.
It's amazing that because you talk about diet and how much diet is related to food production and the use of water. There was a study done a number of years ago. It was called the China Study, and what they were looking at, Julian, was disease. They called it the Western disease. How come people that live in Western-style societies like Europe, the United States, have higher incidence of heart disease, cancer, diabetes? And they related it all back to food production because originally they thought, well, maybe it's genetic. It's people in Asia or Asian descent are genetically programmed different. But when you take Asians out of their culture, bring them over to the United States, put them on a Western diet, they start developing the same problems: heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. So one of the solutions that you can talk about, not only creating a healthier world, but less demand, less energy use, is a better diet. I want to, related to that, I want to talk about another problem that we're running out of in addition to water, and that is high quality soil. Because we need to produce more food. And the only way that I know that you can do that, either one, you get more output per acre of land, or two, you get more arable land. But we're seeing major factors around the globe today that are leading to land degradation. How did we get to this point?
Well, we've been aware of land degradation and desertification for a very, very long time. Alas, we have done very little about it. I mean, I think America learned its lesson during the Dust Bowl crisis of the 1930s, and it put in place sustainable farming systems. Australia likewise had similar experiences, but the world at large is still degrading its farmland at a horrifying rate. I mean, there are soils in the Indus Valley that have been farmed for 4,000 years now, and they've never had a lick of fertilizer on them. So they've mined out the nutrients, and perhaps they very often lost the soils in floods and in dust storms and things like that. So this process of degradation is still affecting most of the world's farming soils. Then, as we mentioned earlier, you've got the effect of cities expanding onto farming areas. And not only the city expanding its own footprint, but also its recreational catchment, all those golf courses and horse farms and holiday farms and resorts and things like that. They're all taking up good farming land as well. And this pushes farming out into the drier, more marginal and more risky regions. So the whole food supply becomes more risky whenever a city expands. And that's one of the things that we're not factoring in as well, that a really good, reliable country with good rainfall and things like that, we're just burying it under concrete, or we're burying it under a recreational activity. And we're pushing the farmers out into the dry country where the climate may change on them and they may have a 10-year drought like we just had in Australia. So that makes the food supply much less reliable, and it causes these spikes in prices of food to happen and to ripple around the world. We're not seeing that impact. So the cities need to control their footprint. That is really important. They have got to stop taking land away from farmers. That means cities may have to intensify.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just watched last week a new documentary called Food Matters, and they talk about this very thing, that if we were to go back to the way we used to farm, let's say over 100 years ago, before these large, big corporate farms that we see today by major corporations, let's say a farmer had 3 acres. He may plant corn on 1 acre 1 year, and then after harvest, he'd let the land go fallow, and then what he would do is maybe plant the 2nd acre, so it would allow the nutrients to replenish themselves. But today we keep plowing the same acre over and over again, and we're only putting certain kind of chemical fertilizers into the soil, not all of the nutrients that we need in our food. And you talk about, you call nutrients the new oil.
Yeah, that's right, because they are scarce. And even though there is plenty of mineral phosphorus and potash around the world, they are going to become scarce and they are going to run out later in this century. And that means the prices are going to go very high. And there is no modern farming system that doesn't depend on these sources of nutrients. I mean, we have replaced a world farming system which has sustained us for 10,000 years, which was basically down to recycling. Our great-grandparents used to fork the manure back onto the field, and that nourished the next crops, which in turn fed the people, and so on. And they had a cycle, a recycling system. We don't have a recycling system any longer. We either dig the nutrients out of a mine, or we dig them out of the soil using crops, and we remove them, and they're gone for good, because very often they end up flushing down the river and into the sea at the end of the chain. Our sewage, for example, which contains many of these nutrients, is mostly disposed of in ways that, we lose the nutrients. So we need to rethink about those whole systems and recapturing a system that has supported the human race, as I say, for 10 millennia.
I want to move on to something else, and we've seen this with the way that they raise livestock today, where they keep them in pens and they feed them corn. One thing that we've started to see in supermarkets here over the last decade is farm fish. But the farm fish that we're buying in the supermarket, for example, salmon, isn't the same thing as the salmon that we catch in the wild, because like what they're doing with chickens and cows, pork, other forms, what we're doing is we're feeding fish corn. So we're talking about a different kind of nutrient and a different kind of protein once it's harvested.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that is probably a mistake, and we are seeing more and more consumers reacting against the farmed product, the intensely farmed product, and starting to demand more wild food or more food that's been extensively produced. And, in this is one of the answers. A third of the world consists of savanna grasslands, and those grasslands actually support most of our livestock still. And if we manage those grasslands in a sustainable way, in other words, we allow the natural vegetation to regenerate, we don't crash graze them into the ground, we will not only produce more and better meat from those grasslands, we will also lock up more carbon. They will become an immense sponge for carbon, sucking carbon out of the air and helping us to combat climate change. So there is a really good reason to support the old-style pastoral grazing industries, the cowboy-type industries, if you like, that used to exist a century ago, but using modern technology to ensure that the management of the animals does not hammer the landscape. If we can do that, we will have better quality food, much richer and more nutritionally balanced food, but it will be more expensive, I make no bones about that, and it will return a better living to the farmer or grazier who produces it. but it will be more sustainable than the system we've got at the moment. Because, you know, those farmed fish, it takes 5 tons of wild-caught fish to make the food for 1 ton of farmed fish. So we're mining the oceans in order to support fish farming, and that's not sustainable. If you feed the fish on grain, well, they taste like chickens. They don't have flavour. And, of course, the grain causes erosion and landscape degradation elsewhere as well. So fish farming then degrades the wider landscape. So these are problems that we have to grapple with. There are solutions to them, I make no bones about that, but we're not putting enough effort and brains into finding